The Quo-Cast, a Status Quo fan podcast.
This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of The Quo-Cast, and I'm joined by John Williams. Welcome to the podcast, John. Tell me, what is your connection to Status Quo?
Well, my connection to Status Quo is that I was working at Sanctuary Records in the early 2000s. I was senior vice president of A&R, and I signed them to the record label for their album, The Party Ain't Over Yet. And they had been with Universal previous to signing to Sanctuary. And I brokered the deal with Simon Porter, the Quo manager. And
how long what is the process for signing an act like that?
Well, it's a bit like getting married. You have to court to start with. And so I met Simon for lunch a few times, and we talked about the concerns of Quo and the manager are, will they get proper distribution? Will they be funded properly? Will they have enough oomph behind them to make them chart? Can an independent do the same thing as a major? So a lot of the conversations were not consoling him, but making him understand that we at Sanctuary could do as good a job as anybody. And so that I can't remember how many months that took, but an A&R man's job is to be aware of what's available on the marketplace, and then to bring it in, and then help make the record with the band, if they need help, that is.
And by that point, obviously that is a humongous era for Quo. It's probably one of their most successful times in recent years. They were on Coronation Street. They did a lot of other things. Were you aware of this stuff? Was this stuff already in the pipeline when you were talking to them?
Absolutely. Absolutely aware that Simon Porter is a great manager, and he came with a smorgasbord of ideas that were enticing. So we knew that it was their 40th anniversary. There was a big European tour. There was an opportunity to sell records in Europe. And we put together a fantastic campaign for him to show to the band, which convinced them that we would be the right partner for them.
And prior to this, had you met or dealt with Quo before? Because, you have almost 50 years in the music industry. You must have come across them at some time.
Well, I'd come across them, but not really met them. I'd been working at Jacobs Studios in Surrey in 1981 or 2. I was producing a band signed to Rocket called Expandis. And we were in one studio and Quo were in the other studio. So we might have said hello, but I doubt if they knew who I was from Adam. Of course, you feel you know them because they are absolute legends. So I got to know them a bit later.
And what was that like? Can you share any stories with us about your experiences with them?
Well, other than I have the utmost respect for them as musicians, as people, as artists. They've got what's the track record? No group has accumulated more UK hits or has a wider top 20 chart span, and only the Beatles and Rolling Stones can better their tally of top 20 albums. This is history. This is one of the greatest bands in the world, and I was excited to bring them to our record label and to represent them and let them make the record they wanted to make. I didn't have anything to do with making the record other than to say I thought they had a lead single, which was the title track of the album, which got to number 11.
Which was, as you say, a huge hit, and written by John David as well, who is an accomplished songwriter.
Yeah, he wrote a couple of songs on the album, I think.
Yes, that, and I want to say the All That Counts Is Love, which was another single.
That's it. They were the first two singles, and I think I got Mike Paxman produced the album, but I got an engineer that I used a lot to do radio mixes, Steve Evans, who I'd met when we signed Robert Plant to Sanctuary.
What difference would he have made to the process?
Well, he had been quite successful at having radio records, and sometimes it's leaving a bigger bandwidth in the allowing the compression to be made by the radio station rather than having the record rammed to the top in the first place. So he's just a very experienced mix engineer, and the difference was subliminal in a sense, and but it worked and it got on the radio and it sounded great on the radio.
So what you're saying there is, obviously we know of a radio mix as most of the time just being a shortened version of a song, but obviously that was remixed in order to sound better on the radio.
Yes, and actually Radio 1 and Radio 2 are quite keen to have, one of the questions they ask when they're playlisting a record is, well, who mixed it? And if you say, well, the guy who produced it mixed it, they say, well, what about, why did you get Bill Bloggs to do it, or Trevor Fried Fish? You know, whoever's the hot guy at the time. And so it's generally done that a radio mix gets done by a Chenzo Townsend or someone like him, and they tend to make records which may sound fantastic on the radio, although the difference between the version I might have made of a record and that they make is, as I say, subliminal.
It's interesting, you know, the different layers that go into this stuff. And with that in mind, obviously before you signed Quo to Sanctuary Records, they'd already acquired the rights to the Pi recordings.
Sanctuary had, yes.
Yes.
At Sanctuary, we bought a company called Castle Communications, which was based in Newell in Surrey, and part of the catalogue was the Pi recordings. So that included the Status Quo pictures and Matchstick Men messages from the Status Quo and their first two albums, and all the Searchers records and all the Petula Clark records, and just some fantastic catalogue. And part of the equation was that maybe we can sign some of these original Pi artists again, so we can exploit the catalogue at the same time. It's a double whammy, in fact. And actually, I did do a lot of work with Petula Clark, who was Britain's most successful female artist ever. I made 2 solo albums with hers in this room I'm talking to you now, which is the little shed at the bottom of my garden. And actually, she and Status Quo would rehearse in the same rehearsal rooms in Wimbledon, and they were always popping into each other's studio to see each other and say hello.
And is that a common thing in that situation?
What, to be saying hello?
Well, yeah, to be mixing like that.
Well, I think that Rick Parfitt was a fan of Petula's and never really met her, so he took it as an opportunity to come and say hello, and they got on very well.
Well, that's excellent. And you've been working with Petula Clark in your latest project, which we will talk about in a moment. But I wanted to ask, I mean, obviously, The Party Ain't Over Yet as an album was really successful. It got a couple of hit singles, lots of exposure. They performed obviously on Coronation Street, on the ITV anniversary special. They were everywhere at that moment in time. What happened to a second album on Sanctuary?
I don't know. It's a very good question. I think I'd left Sanctuary by that stage. I think that the industry went through some changes, and some of the funding that was going on didn't happen, and it didn't seem that Sanctuary was as stable a home as it had been in the previous 5 years. So I actually jumped ship and went and started my own label, W14, at Universal, which is where they went next, I think, to do their 40th anniversary, the greatest hits Excess all areas, was that?
It was around that time, yes.
And to be honest, I don't know. I can't recall what it was. I was busy setting up another label, W14, where I signed the Proclaimers again, the second time, and Paul Heaton and Alison Moyet and the Blue Nile. Actually, no, Blue Nile I signed to Sanctuary.
There are so many different processes that are involved in this stuff, and we can't remember every step of the way.
The journey is for an A&R man, signing the artist, wooing them, getting them to sign to the label, making sure they have sufficient songs for the project, making sure that the right producer is in place, making sure the right mixes get done, and then they get mastered correctly, and then they get released, and then that's when you hand over to the marketing department. And in a sense, my role as an A&R man is concluded, because I'm then looking for the next project, which is to feed the machine, because you have to have it's a conveyor belt of record releases, and you can't just say, well, we've got nothing next month to release, because then you're out of a job. You're a bit like a football manager. You've got another game to play, and you've got to keep on winning. So there's many ups and downs.
Well, I mean, since then, as you say, you went on to form another thing and saw great success with it. And really, I suppose on the Quo level, have you seen or heard from them since?
Well, I met them a couple of times. I was in Australia at the beginning of 2000 and went to see them play in Sydney. And I was with Simon, and I met them at... I went down to Francis' studio in Croydon. Simon Porter was developing an opera singer called Kate Dowman, and I'd been writing songs with her, and we needed a studio. So we went down to Francis' house and went to his studio, which is at the bottom of his garden, like my studio is at the bottom of my garden, except his is a bit different. His is a bit bigger, and it's a bit better equipped. And he's a really great guy. I really liked him a lot. He's one of the unsung heroes of British pop business, because his voice is just the perfect pop voice. I love it. I think he's great. And I think that the Quo records they've made, which seem so effortless to listen to, they are the hardest to make. To have this kind of sleight of hand, which just makes you think the band turned up and played it live in the studio. I know from experience making Paul Heaton and Jacqui Abbott records that the sleight of hand is to make the record appear to be live like that, but they get made like a Creedence Clearwater Revival record, which is one layer at a time and painstakingly poured over and analyzed and make sure the tempo is correct and the key is correct. And anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff goes into producing a record, and they've done it successfully for so long, and their records sound so utterly effortless on the radio that I'm pretty darn sure that they are put together in a really considerate way.
Well, I might be biased in saying that I agree with you, considering the podcast that we're on. But if anyone should know that, it's you, because you've had a great success in production over the past, 40 years now?
Well, I wanted to be an A&R man. I was an A&R man who could produce records. It used to be the thing that A&R men would do in the 50s and 60s. So Mickey Most, George Martin, Tony Hatch, Chris Blackwell were all A&R men, who actually owned their own record labels as well, but could say to a band, as I did to the Proclaimers, I'll sign you and I'll produce the first record with you. And that really takes a skill which I learned that skill by producing Radio 1 live sessions for years. So I do know how records are put together, and it's all about the vocals. It's all about having something which carries I call it the chassis of the song, which is the backing track. So you've got to get that right, but then you've got to hear the vocal loud and proud. That's the hit. Nobody ever says, I can't hear the kick drum. They say, I can't hear the vocal. And when you get a mix wrong, it's generally because the vocals aren't loud enough.
Which is interesting, because a lot of the great records, the vocals sit slightly under the instrumentation.
Well, it seems like that, yes. But a lot of, for example, if you listen to a Proclaimers record or a Petula Clark record, they sit well above the backing track, and most huge hit records have very loud vocals.
Yeah, which I suppose in the case of the Proclaimers, I mean, at times they're practically shouting.
They would warm up before a vocal performance in the studio. They'd spend about an hour warming their voices up. They would hold notes for 30 seconds, for a minute, and it's got most very extraordinary noise. And then they'd say, "We're ready," and they would put it. Then they sang with soul. I mean, Craig has got one of the greatest voices of a singer I've ever come across. He really sings from the heart and the soul.
And manages to replicate. And I was saying to you before this, I'm a great Proclaimers fan, and I saw them live maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I think Quo do have this ability as well to be able to replicate what is on the record, even though the record might be 20, 30, sometimes 40 years previously.
Yes, because it's the simplicity of the melody. I mean, the great Quo hits, rocking all over the world, is Caroline, Whatever You Want, Down, Down. They're all very simple melodies, but you try and write one of these songs and you just get to cliche, whereas Francis can sing what is almost cliche sometimes, but he sings it with such ease and with such spirit that you never question lyrics with Quo. They just seem to fit the bill. I used to teach a songwriting module at the University of Westminster, and one of the things I used to implore into students was try and pick a title which was like an everyday expression, like "Well, did you ever?" or those kind of great songs where I heard it through the grapevine, which the Quo is littered with, these kind of everyday expression songs.
Do you think that's dying out slightly in songwriting?
Oh, I think that it's yes and no, probably.
I mean, teaching songwriting, I mean, was that a difficult task?
Well, I used to say to the student, and I only had about 6 students a year that I would teach in the spring semester. I was just a visiting lecturer, and I would make sure they understood that all of my comments about their songs were just as I saw it. So don't take this as a criticism, but this is my opinion, and you can take it or leave it. And I'm not necessarily right either. But a friend of mine who's one of the great singers, songwriters, Jimmy Webb, has got a great book on songwriting, which I would implore all the students to read as well, because it gives you great little tips about scenarios or about subject matter. And he was always very keen on discovering what was the nut about a song. What's it about? What are you trying to say? And so many songs, my students, just don't really have a story. They just have one thing that happened with no explanation and nothing, no side story. And so I would always just try and make them think a bit harder, try and expand the idea. You know, had they thought about changing the rhyming scheme in the chorus. Those kind of little tips.
Yeah, I think when it comes to songwriting, perhaps a little events that happened in the mid-20th century, the rock and roll boom that started obviously at Sun Studios and various other places, where pretty much I'm also a reviewer on the side. I review music from this period, and a lot of the songs are very one note. They have sort of, we're going to rock this or rock that. It's very kind of, it's more about the feeling than it is about what they're saying.
So a Quo record has this shuffle. They make you feel good straight away. They got this shuffle. And they're like Chuck Berry records, aren't they? They're kind of R&B. They're just great R&B records, dressed up in pop clothing.
Yeah, which is something that has sort of come in and out of fashion, I think, and is possibly coming back.
Well, the Quo have been in and out of fashion. I was in a band myself in the 60s at school, and we used to cover pictures of Matchstick Men, but then nothing was. They had a fallow period, didn't they? After that, until Down the Dustpipe, was that the next kind of?
Yes.
Next kind of when they threw away their Carnaby Street clothes and wore denim, or just wore normal clothes and didn't dress up, and then they were a band of the people, and they've been a band of the people ever since. I don't know anybody who dislikes Quo. Even Trevor Dan, who was the Radio 1 producer, who was allegedly responsible for banning Quo, which wasn't a ban at all, loves the band. He absolutely loves their records. He's a huge Quo fan, and I was telling someone this morning that I was going to be on the Quo podcast, and he said, "Oh, they're fantastic, aren't they? I love them." And it's easy to love them. They're Francis and Rick. What a great team they were.
Yeah, they were, and obviously that partnership, although still on record, is much sadly missed live. And I have met people who don't like it and probably think that it's an unusual thing that there's a Quo podcast. However, once you dig deeper into it, as we said earlier, with the A&R work at Sanctuary, there's so many different layers to it.
Yes, and I was listening to, someone told me that The Party Ain't Over wasn't Francis's favourite record, and I listened to it last night. I thought, this is a really great album. Maybe there's too many tracks on it. Maybe there's just one or two too many. But it's I think it's well produced and the songs are good.
Yeah, I think that tends to be the way with modern Quo. I mean, I think the most recent album had 10 to 12 tracks on it, whereas up until a certain period there was sometimes up to 16, 18 tracks on an album, which is possibly too many.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that 10 or 11 is good. I mean, on my album, talk about my records. I got an album coming out myself, which has got 10 songs on it, and that's enough for anybody to listen to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, tell us about this, the John Williams Syndicate, and you released a single in January, around January time, called New Flag, which is a collaboration with Petula Clark. I mean, first off, how did that come about? We know that you worked with her previously, but how did you broach that with her?
My previous project, I've been producing Paul Heaton and Jacqui Abbott albums, and I've done 4 of them. And the last one, Manchester Calling, went to #1 this time last year. And so we were celebrating being top of the charts. And then the whole country was put into lockdown. I'm fortunate enough to have a recording studio at the bottom of my garden. So I just decided I'd go write a bunch of songs, because as I always like to do, I will do versions of the songs that Petula might sing, or Claudia Brucken, or I write them with them, or I develop little ideas and sketches. But since they couldn't come to my studio, I thought, well, I'll finish a few myself. And I had played them to a few people, and they said, well, you don't sound so bad. Why don't you put them out yourself? Or why don't you finish them yourself? Which I did. And I was going to release New Flag by myself. Then I thought, well, it might be easier if I had it as a duet with someone who was well known, because no one knows who the hell I am. And because I've kept quite a sort of low profile, although I did have a couple of singles out on Rack Records with Mickey Most in the late 70s. My intention was never to be an artist, but just an all-rounder. And so Petula heard the record, and I asked her, would she like to sing on? And she said, you'd love to. So she did her vocals in Geneva and flew them over to me here, and I placed them on the record. And it's lovely. It's a lovely record. New Flag, John Williams Syndicate with Petula Clark. And that gave me the idea to maybe do some collaborations with other artists that I liked. So I worked with Claudia Brucken, who was the singer in the band called Propaganda, who was signed to ZTT in the mid-80s, known as the Thinking Man's Abbott. And Claudia sang on a couple of songs. And then I got Guy Barker, who was a trumpet player of great renown, Britain's Miles Davis, to play on a few tracks. And Ben Walker, who is Total Guitar called him the best acoustic guitarist in the world. And he plays on 4 or 5 tracks electric guitar. He's one of the best electric players, actually. And I just hauled in James Hallowell, who's an old friend of mine from the Waterboys, and eventually got 10 tracks done, and I'm putting them out and seeing what the world thinks. I'm not expecting top 5, and I'm not sure what measure of success I need to say that's fine. But I've had some good reaction to it, and I'm happy with having done it.
Well, I know that one station that's really got behind you in terms of radio is Boom Radio, who are a recently launched station.
Yes, it's been fascinating because getting radio play is very difficult. There's an overabundance of artists with underabundance of time available to them on the radio. So getting played anywhere is a bonus. And Boom is a news station, DAB and digital on your computer, started by a lot of ex-Radio 1 disc jockeys like Kid Jensen and David Hamilton. So there's a lot of familiar voices, and the music they play is actually very, well, as I say, it's very good. You can sort of hear Robert Palmer, Annie Lennox, then you hear the John Williams Syndicate with New Flag, and it seems to fit in. And they're very selective about what they pick up, but I was just thrilled. They've been, I say they've been hammering it, but they play it about once a day. But it's phenomenal, and it makes me very happy.
And obviously, with the current situation being as it is, that means that pretty much everybody, as you say with Petula, she had to record elsewhere. Does that mean everyone else had to as well?
Yes. So I played a lot of things myself on the record, and I would program drums and program keyboards, and then have a very good sketch. And then a lot of my friends have their own studios. So Pete Marshall, who is the drummer in the Paul Heaton band, has got a basement with a drum kit set up. So I would send him the track, an almost finished track, and he would drum over it, and I would then remove my drums or keep them together. And I did the same, although the room is big enough to have one other player in here with me. So Guy did his trumpet in here, and Ben Walker came up and did some guitars in my room. But all of the backing vocals, which were done by a young girl called Isabella Coldstock and a rapper called Slicko DiCaprio, did their vocals in their own places, and would send them as WAV files to me, and I would then place them in the track.
Which must be a world away from where you started in production.
Well, it's just completely the exact opposite of my skill set, because I for years I was the kind of producer who was like a film director, and I would arrange the session, make sure I had the right engineer, the right space, the right time, and the right players, and I would make sure we had the right takes and the right vocal takes, and compile them with the artist. But I never touched the desk. I leave that role to the engineer. So of course, modern DAW workstations, I've learned how to use Logic Pro X, and I'm not the speediest, but a lot of these tracks I would mix with Louis Dransfield, who's one of the students. Actually, he's no longer a student, but was at the University of Westminster with me. And I feel quite confident about going into a mix after it's been finished and tweaking things by myself, which is what Mickey Most used to do. He knew how to do that. And it's pretty important as a producer to know how to add more, whatever it is you want to add, or take out what you don't want.
And earlier you mentioned that kind of the art of a great mix is to make it sound as if it's played as live. How hard is it to do that when everyone is recording in different locations? Well,
you have to get the song right to start with. I mean, you have to get the key right, the performance. I mean, it's very difficult when you're recording in a small shed like this. So I think it sounds pretty live. I think the addition of real drums has been the changing factor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a producer myself. I say that I'm literally just a hobbyist, and the drums is literally the hardest thing, because some people like to produce it all down one line. Other people like sort of separate areas of the drum kit to be in different places, mic'd up individually.
Oh, well, I think that as long as I'm pretty fussy about drums when we make records in Manchester, the big studio. And when I did these drums for this record with Pete Marshall, initially he started giving me 8 stems with stuff for me then to mix down. I said, just give me a stereo mix. And it sounded really great. And I think as long as the drums are being covered and they sound right and comfortable, it's the vocals that people are listening to. They don't suddenly think, well, that's a funny old hi-hat sound. That's just not part of the thought process. The thought process is, God, he sings out of tune, or I can't hear the vocals, or I don't like that song. And the rest is a voyage of discovery.
I must be the only person I know then that's obsessed with snare.
Oh, well, listen, you're right to be obsessed as well, because I remember being teased at Chrysalis when I had my first hit record with the House Martins, and someone left me a note on my desk saying, Paul McCartney rang. And I said, what did he want? He said he loves your snare sound. But I was actually looking for a snare sound this morning. I've been writing this new song, and I heard a mix of Nina Simone's "Feeling Good" on a Peloton ride I was making, and so I've been trying to find the 808 snare sound that they've emulated. So yeah, it is absolutely important. So what I was going to add about the drum sound I use on my own stuff is that often I will add an 808 snare on top of it just to blend in, so you've got the snap. Because the worst thing is you get a dull snare sound.
As well as the vocal, it helps it to jump out.
So something Mickey Most said to me once, he said, listen, the human ear only hears one thing at a time. So they'll hear the vocal, they'll hear the snare drum, they'll hear the little string riff, they'll hear the guitar solo, but all the other stuff that is passes people by as long as it's there and taken care of. But you only hear one thing at a time. And for years, I used to think, people will discover that little organ there in the background, but you don't. And when he would say, push that vocal, push that snare sound, or push that anything, and you'd gingerly push up, 1 dB, he would say, well, 5 or 6 dBs, go for it. Let's hear the difference.
I mean, there was a period in the 1980s where everything was very overproduced. A lot of the stuff, certainly in the Quo camp, was incredibly overproduced to some ears. I mean, what's your take on that? And was there like a noticeable change as we got further into the modern day?
I think what happened was the advent of 48-track recording, which was, so if you in the 50s, it'd be 2-track, people performing around a microphone and placed in a room so that you could hear them in the right kind of perspective. Then came 4-track, and I think 8-track was Sgt. Pepper. And then they reckon they could put 2 8-tracks together and make 16, and then you could bounce down. So what happened in the pop world was that you could lock 2 24-track machines together and bounce down to and so suddenly you could have lots more choice. So whereas beforehand on 24-track you would say, well, I've got, in fact it'd be 23-track because you'd have 1 track reading the code for the computer, and you would have drums over 8 tracks. You'd have the bass and 2 guitars, keyboard, and the vocals, and so everything was specified. And suddenly with 48-track, you think, oh well, let's put that extra thing on there, and we'll make a decision about it later. And of course, when you're working on Logic or Pro Tools, infinity is and you try an idea and think, oh, I'll review that later, and then you keep going, and suddenly you find your track's got 75 tracks that are running at the same time, and all that happens is utter confusion. So I try and good housekeeping is in order all the time, labeling stuff and reviewing it and discarding, and never saying, oh, that will come in handy later.
And at what point do you say, I'm going to stop this now, or I've found the mix that I want?
Oh, it's so difficult. It's so difficult to say stop, because generally speaking, it will stop when I know I've got a mastering room booked to master the record for a production, for a release situation. And I'll be mixing the record right up to the night before, because I'm never happy until I'm happy.
And so a mastering room, for those that aren't familiar, what is that?
Well, the mastering room was initially where you transferred the tapes to a vinyl, to make to a lathe to make a vinyl record. And of course, vinyl is still done, but generally the master is made first. It's where you run all the songs together, make sure that they have the right gap between them, that the levels of volumes, because sometimes the levels are different. So maybe that you have a multi-producer album and they all come in different volumes, so you have to level them all out. And then you have the last chance. The engineer might say, it needs more top, and you can add more top, you can add more bottom. You can't actually change you can't make a vocal louder. You can make it more compressed and sing louder, but you can't ride things. And it's a bit of a dark art, to be honest. When I made Proclaimers records and House Martins records, I used to master them or cut them in those days, because it was cutting the vinyl acetate from which they manufacture the vinyl. And the Aaron Chakravarti, who was at the master room, would say, I'm not doing anything with this mix because it's perfect. I'm just going to run it off as it is. And then he would refuse it. He would sometimes not my work, but he would refuse to cut things. He said, no, it's not mixed properly. I'm not mastering it.
What do you think makes a good mix?
Well, a good mix is when you feel that everything has come together in an harmonious way and still sounds exciting. So there's some you can change things subtly, sometimes by adding a tambourine or taking out a tambourine or putting hand claps on record can suddenly up the excitement level. So it's got to sound just right, and the only person who knows that it sounds right is the artist. I can mix a Paul Heaton and Jacqui Abbott album 100 different ways, but unless it's Paul's vision, then it's not right. So he has to be absolutely satisfied that this is how he wants it, and it's so much easier working with artists who know how they want their record to sound, because all you have to do as a producer is create that for them. That I'm not a producer like Trevor Horn, for example, who will have his own vision of a record and makes brilliant, recordings. And he's genius. But I'm not. I make records where I want the artist to tell me that's right, or tell me, yeah, just a bit more bit louder on the vocal there, or what the fuck do you think you're doing?
I mean, you want it to have an air of authenticity.
Yeah. It's got to just sound natural. It's got to sound like it just happened. I mean, the joy of making records is a very, very extraordinary occupation to have, because you're obsessed with detail throughout. I mean, I write everything down that's happening. So I have dozens of books full of tempos and maps and what we've achieved and ticking off things and rehearsals. I mean, with Paul Heaton and Jacqui Abbott, we rehearsed for 2 months in a rehearsal room before we even set foot in the recording studio. And he wants the band to know every song inside out. So it does help when the band knows a new song like they would know an old familiar song they've gigged for years. Which
seems like a very old way of doing it, because, of course, the Beatles did that on their early recordings. They were basically playing their set on albums.
They were, and they would do things in a day. They just set up and play. And that's when I recorded Radio 1 live sessions for 5-6 years in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. I suddenly realized that if the band knew the song and played them live, all you had to do was just capture them in full flight, and it would be exciting. And you could do it. You could record and mix 4 tracks in a day.
And it's an interesting thing, because the live thing, and I've asked other producers about this, what is the difference between studio and live production?
Do you mean what's the difference between recording an album and making a live album?
Yeah.
They're completely different things. Where a studio recording, and I use Paul Heaton and Jacqui Abbott albums as an example, because it's what I've been concentrating on for the last 5-6 years, and it's taken a lot of my time. But we will record the band all set up and keep only the drums, and then we'll make sure that the drums, every note is right and it's not slipped and it's on a grid, and but it sounds natural. And then I'll work with the bass player for 2 days. We'll put bass guitar on all the songs. Then I'll work with the guitarist for a week. We'll layer up the guitars, and everything's done piece by piece. Because if you want to make a hit record, you've got to have the flexibility of things not spilling over each other. So a live recording is everything is spilling. So you want to capture the general performance and just trust to luck that the live is going to be exciting. So generally speaking, live records don't sound as good as studio records, because you can't isolate things without hearing spill on the backing vocals. So there are certain things you can't do. like eradicate a voice, because it's spilling over the whole drum track.
There are methods of getting rid of certain frequencies, but once you do that, you're eliminating some part of the source you were planning to capture with it anyway.
Yeah, you're quite right, Jamie. It's you take out one frequency and you harm another, so it's tit for tat.
Yeah. So the album with the John Williams Syndicate, when is it coming out?
Well, it's coming out first week in June. I'm going through a process at the moment of trying to make an audience that I don't have aware that this record's been made. I'm very proud of it, and so I'm using the help of my known artists on the record to help with their social media to try and grow a product organically. Right. So I've got another single coming out, and I'll probably take another one after that. And if I can sell a few records, that'd be great.
I know it's relatively early days, but are you planning any projects after that?
Well, I never know what is going to be ahead of me until it hits me. So I would obviously love to make another Paul Heaton record, but that's up to him. I've made 4. He may want to change. He may want to keep the same regime. But everything's been put on hold because of COVID, and people's tours haven't happened. So everything's been put back a bit. So I'm just using the opportunity to finesse some promotion and write some new songs, and just breathe in, breathe out, enjoy life, and not take things too seriously.
Well, I wish you all the best with the success of the album, and of course future projects. And I'm sure we'll be hearing some more from you in the future. But John Williams, thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Jamie, talking to you. It's been a nice chat. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Quo-Cast with me, Jamie Dyer, talking to John Williams. His new album with the John Williams Syndicate, Out of Darkness, will be available from the 4th of June 2021. And if you'd like to find out more information about John and the John Williams Syndicate, you can go to johnowenwilliams.com. That's johnowenwilliams.com. I will also leave the Linktree link in the comments of this podcast, and go and give him a like on Facebook as well. Facebook.com/The John Williams Syndicate.